I actually want to start in Matthew chapter 25, and then we'll go for our scripture reading in Luke 5. But in Matthew 25, 2 weeks ago, we began the new year with a message entitled, "You Have the Power." And at the end of the parable of the talents, um, it had this phrase that we looked at about, "To him who has more will be given, and to him who has less, less will be given." And we just saw how our little choices, our little atomic, tiny decisions and habits, how over time they can have such a big effect on our life. And that the way to change our lives is to make those small decisions every day, those important things, those small commitments and habits. And when you do them over time, daily, hourly, it makes a much greater impact. And this week, as I was thinking about this parable and I would kind of see this as a part two to "You Have the Power." I was thinking about, but what hinders us from living the life God is calling us to? And I think there's a lot of things that can get in the way, but I want to touch on a few things that came to mind. But in this parable of the talents, in Matthew 25 and verse 14, it talks about how it tells the parable of a man who was going to be leaving, and he wanted to leave some of his resources. Specifically, it says talents or bags of gold in the NIV. And he gives 10 to one servant, he gives 5 to another servant, and 1 to the last servant. He gives 5 to one servant, 2 to one servant, and then 1 to the last servant. And he asks each one of them to, watch over these resources while he's gone. And it says that the first man puts the money immediately to use. Doesn't tell us what he did, but he invests it, he does something, and he gains 5 more talents. So he ends up with 10. The second guy has 2 talents, and he puts them to work, and he gains 2 more. But the last guy, and this is kind of the theme of the parable, the last guy is afraid, and he hides the talent. He buries it in the ground, doesn't put it to work, doesn't do anything with it, and saves it and thinks his master may be happy because at least he protected it. At least he saved it. But in the parable, the master is very pleased with the first 2 servants, but it says he is upset with the last one and says, "You're wicked and lazy. Why didn't you at least put it in the bank and get a little bit of interest with it?" And so he says, "Take that talent from the last one, give it to the first guy." And that's how the parable ends. And it's interesting, a parable for Jesus to tell. And we might think, well, it's nice to be safe. Isn't Jesus want us to protect things? And this last servant protected that talent, so couldn't that be a good thing? But in Jesus' parable, he specifically wants us to see that as a bad thing, that he wants us to take a risk. And I would suggest to you that in order to live the life that God wants you to live, it will require taking a risk. In fact, there is probably no way to get around it, because I think God calls us to take risks for him. Now, I'm not talking about participating in risky behavior for the sake of being risk-taking. And I know some of you probably are risk takers. I've heard some of your stories. I'm sure some of you have maybe gone skydiving, maybe bungee jumped. Some of you probably drive too fast. That's risk-taking behavior. But God isn't, I'm not talking about just taking risks for the sake of taking risks or taking risks for the sake of thrills. The risks that I want to talk about are the risks that I think Jesus is talking about, which is risks that are spiritual, risks of the heart, risks that involve our soul, that involve us being uncomfortable, risks that push us to do something we know we should do, but it's hard for us. There's a book called A Failure of Nerve by Edwin Friedman. And Edwin Friedman was a rabbi who also went on to get his master's in systems theory and family counseling. And he wrote several good books. He was famous for a book called Generation to Generation, and he just shared the research of how we pass on to our family and our children our own issues and our own biases and preferences, etc. But he wrote a book that I really enjoyed entitled A Failure of Nerve. And in Friedman's book, A Failure of Nerve, he argues that so much of the good that needs to happen in this world does not happen because we're afraid to take a risk. We're afraid to do the right thing. We're afraid to challenge the status quo. We're afraid to try to make changes that need to be made, but maybe they're not popular, or maybe they're not what everyone would see as good changes, even though we are convicted that they are good. You know, one of the things about following Jesus is you're probably going to find yourself at odds with the culture of your day. You can't be a disciple of Christ without, in some form, some way, running into some challenge and controversy with modern day culture or any culture. I would say for Jesus followers, from the beginning of time until now, they have had to be countercultural at times because it was the right thing. Because they were following God, they came to a natural clash with their culture. And Jesus himself said, I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. And at times he said to bring division, even in your own family, perhaps. He said sometimes a mother will be against her daughter, or a father against his son, or a son against his father, or a daughter against his mother, because there are times when doing the right thing means we have to be at odds, or it may put us at odds, or we may at least worry that it will put us at odds with someone we love, or our own family, or maybe our own job, or maybe our own community, or maybe our own church even. It's possible. Even Jesus was often at odds with the church of his day. And so we shouldn't be surprised. And so Friedman says in his book, A Failure of Nerve, he said, there are three major things that we can see that hinder people, that hinder societies, that hinder groups of people from fulfilling their potential, from being the best that they can be, from doing the right thing, from doing what God may have called them to do. And so I want to share three of his insights and just encourage you to kind of contemplate and say, is this something that's affecting me? So number one, he said, is the treadmill effect. And if you're taking notes, you can write that down. Do you get caught up in the treadmill effect? He said the treadmill effect is this. It is the lie that we can solve things if only we try harder. We can fix this if only we tried harder. We're not succeeding because we haven't tried hard enough. We're failing because we didn't do enough. And if we just put more effort, more money, more whatever into this, then maybe it will succeed. Now, this can be a trap because what it assumes is that we have the right solution. What it assumes is that doing it the way it's always been done is the right way to do it. And if it's not working, it's because we haven't just tried it hard enough. Well, you can see immediately that might not be the answer. Now, in some cases, yes, we might need to try harder, or in some cases, we might need to revisit something and put the right amount of effort and practice and learning into something. So sure, because it works sometimes, we could easily fall into that trap of thinking it works all the time. But sometimes it's like running on a treadmill, and you can run all you want. You can turn up the speed on a treadmill, but you're not going to go anywhere. You're not going to get anywhere. And that's why he called it the treadmill effect. In fact, Friedman says, I often think of this effect when I see a fly buzzing into the window. And it just keeps hitting the window harder and harder, more and more. And that poor fly thinks, surely I can go out. It can't see the glass, and it just doesn't understand why he can't join the outdoors. And he keeps bombing against the window. And he said, some of us are like that fly, just hitting our heads against the window, bang, bang, bang. And we don't stop to reflect and say, well, maybe there's something new that we need to consider. Maybe there's something outside of our normal thinking, outside of our normal solution that could come into effect and be a blessing to us here. And that's where I wanted to turn us to Luke chapter 5, because Jesus makes another interesting comparison, another interesting parable, if you will. And in Luke chapter 5, verse 37, he says, no one puts new wine into old wineskin. If you do, the new wine will burst the old wineskin. And then he says it'll be spilled and the wineskin's ruined and you lost the wine. But you put new wine into new wineskins, because then the new wineskin can kind of expand as the new wine expands, and both can be preserved. And Jesus, I've often wondered about this, but I think this concept that Jesus is trying to get across to us fits with what Friedman says, because there are times where we need to let God give us new ideas and new thoughts. Let me give a practical example. Perhaps you have a teenager, as we do. Perhaps you have a college age young person or a middle school age young person. And perhaps you've told them they need to clean their room 1,000 times, and yet the room just doesn't seem to get cleaned. Some parents can relate to what I'm saying. And maybe it's not a room, maybe it's something else. But we as parents sometimes fall into this trap of thinking, well, I'll just tell them again. I just got to keep hammering home on them. But we keep getting the same result. And so Jesus is saying to us, have you considered a different option? Have you considered a different approach? Well, what would that look like? And in your given circumstance, I don't know, but maybe we can pray to God and ask him to show us, how could I approach this differently? Friedman actually tells the story of a mother who is having trouble getting her child to do his homework. And she had been on him and on him for years. And it just seemed like he never wanted to do his homework. He never got to it until she had to get in his face and force him and make him do it. And so Friedman suggested to her, what if instead of trying to control him, you turned the attention to yourself? What if you tried to control yourself instead of him? And the mother was a bit offended and said, what do you mean? I get my things done. And he said, no. What if we stop taking the responsibility from the child, which you're doing by always doing it for him, by always insisting and coming in there and doing it over his shoulder? What if you put the full responsibility on him, and then you turn that attention to not saying anything to him? In fact, you let him know you're not going to bother him and bug him and try to regulate him and try to control him anymore. In fact, you're going to play a game with him. And the game you're going to play is that every time you nag him to do his homework, he's going to get $1. You're going to charge yourself $1. And that's how you're going to help regulate yourself so that you remember not to bug him. So Friedman gave this assignment to the mother, who was a bit skeptical that it would pay off or have much results. And so she went home, she explained everything to the son, and she said, I'm not going to bother you anymore. And if I do, you can charge me $1. Well, the son could not have been happier to hear this new arrangement. And so he said, all right, Mom, we'll do it. And so they agreed to this arrangement. And the mom stopped nagging the son. She fell a couple times and had to pay her $1, but that was a good reminder for her. And over a couple of weeks, she noticed something incredible. The son was doing his homework without her saying anything. In fact, he was doing it better than ever, and he was getting better grades and turning it in on time. And it wasn't completely perfect, but it was way better than it used to be. And I think this is kind of what Jesus means when he says, you can't put new wine into old wineskins. You have to come up with new solutions. Some of the things that God is going to call us to might require us to think new thoughts, to have new ideas. Some of the things that God wants to do in our life may mean that we have to let go of some of our old ways, some of our old habits, some of the ways that we've tried to solve things that were our idea, but maybe they weren't God's idea. You know, some of our relationships might be strained. I'm pretty sure if we took a poll here with all the people that are on this call and on this Zoom meeting, we could all say, yeah, there are some people in my life that just are a little bit difficult. And I'm pretty sure some of us have some relationships that have been strained over the years. And we might say, well, it's their fault. You know, I tried to be nice, but they're always doing this and they always, you know, cause problems and they're always divisive and they don't honor my boundary or whatever we might say about them. But this year, 2024, I want to challenge you. Ask God, is there another way that you could go about that relationship and maybe you could bring reconciliation? I had a very sobering experience this week where one of my best friends, and I've referenced him in sermons before, we've been friends since fifth grade, and he's been by my side in almost everything that's happened to me and always there for me. And unfortunately, he suffers from a genetic heart condition and a genetic condition that affects all of his body, actually. And he was very, very sick this week, and he lives alone, and none of us knew it. And we only kind of put it together when I wasn't getting any responses to any texts. He wasn't answering the phone. And I contacted a mutual friend and we had the same experience. And finally, we had to find someone who lived near him because none of us lived near him. And we got someone who was finally willing to go in the snow to knock on his door and find out what's wrong. And luckily, his door was open because he was in bed and his oxygen had gotten so low that he could barely respond. And he's doing better, thankfully now. But even then, he is suffering from congestive heart failure, and we know this is getting worse for him. His condition is going to gradually get worse. There's nothing more they can do. They put in the pacemaker, they put in new valves, they've done everything they can, and now he's just coming where the heart is giving out. And for me this week, it was very upsetting to think about, wow, here's someone my age and they've been with me through so much. I can't handle that thought of them not being there. They've been such a blessing to my life. And when we think about living in this world, there's so many challenges. And I was just thinking with his story, I said, boy, does he know how much he means to me? Because now I need to tell him. He needs to be made aware. I don't want to be at his funeral giving this impassioned speech, because I will definitely speak from my heart, and there'll be tears shed because he's been there for me and he's been such a meaningful part of my life. But does he know it now? And for you, maybe there's people, family members or friends that the relationship has gotten strained. And I just encourage you, we don't know what 2024 will bring, but wouldn't it be better to reconcile? Wouldn't it be better to feel at peace? Wouldn't it be better to be able to know that, yeah, there were these disagreements, but we worked past that, or we agreed to disagree? There are other options. And that brings us to number 2 in Friedman's list. He says one of the things that prevents us from finding the right solution is that we get obsessed with finding answers and we forget to ask the right question. And this is a fascinating concept because we can easily get so caught up in the answer that we're not even sure what the question was. And if you don't ask the right question, you can never get the right answer. If you always ask the wrong question, or if you're asking the wrong question, no matter what answers you find, the wrong answer will always be the wrong question will always lead to the wrong answer. And so maybe the question, if we use this illustration of a relationship, maybe the question isn't, well, will they ever apologize? Will I ever get that apology that I deserve? And when they apologize, then I'll be their friend. Then I'll reconcile. Well, guess what? Maybe the question should be, have I thought about apologizing? Have I thought about being the bigger person? Would God want me to apologize first, even if they're more in the wrong? And I just use that as an illustration. In any situation, getting the question right is important. And even in the business world, if you're asking the wrong question, you won't be able to find the right solution. It's a very practical thing. So the next dilemma that you're facing, the next challenge you're facing, take some time to reflect and say, am I asking the right question in order to find the right answer? Because if I can get the question right, and I would say in our spiritual lives, the right question is always, God, what would you have me to do? That's always the right question. Sometimes we can get so caught up in what is right and wrong that we don't even ask God, what would you have me to do? Sometimes in the spiritual realm, we can say, well, I can't do that. God wouldn't want me to do that. What if God has a friend of yours who's an alcoholic? And you say, well, God, I'm not going to get involved because he shouldn't be drinking. So that's his problem. And God says, and you never ask the question, God, what would you have me to do? And what if there's some moment where God says, listen, your friend is at a bar, he's drunk, he needs help, he needs a ride home. I need you to go get him. But you say, well, God would never want me to go to a bar. So sorry, I'm not going to do that, because you never ask the question, God, what would you have me to do? Do you see how reframing the question changes the answer that you get? And so in the spiritual life, I think Jesus is challenging us, because there are times, I believe, where God will ask us to do things that we wouldn't expect, that might be a little outside our comfort zone, that might not even seem fair. That's another one I hear in church a lot. Well, Pastor, it's not fair. Well, you're right. But you know what? If God was fair about everything, none of us would be in heaven. All of us would be lost. So I praise God that he's not always fair. His grace is extended to us, and he asks us to extend that grace to others, even in ways that might surprise us or might not be fair. And this leads us to the third thing that Friedman puts in his book. He says we can get stuck in either or thinking. We can get stuck in thinking everything is black and white. Well, it's either this or that. We create these false dichotomies that, well, if this isn't going to happen in the way I want, then I'm out. I'm not going to have any part of it. If this either or thinking is actually, he found, a sign of kind of when we get out of good mental health. Mental illness a lot of times traps people in this black and white either or thinking. But if you think about it, when we're at our best, when we're feeling our best, The world seems full of options, full of possibilities, potential. When we're depressed or discouraged, all we see is very narrow options. In fact, if you talk to someone who's discouraged or depressed, often they'll say, well, there's no hope. There's nothing I can do about it. And if you're in a good place, you might be thinking to yourself, well, actually, there's a lot you can do about it. You haven't tried this. You haven't tried that. You haven't. Why don't we, get this? Why don't we go out here? But when we're depressed, when we're in a bad place mentally, we start to think very narrowly. We start to think everything is black and white. Well, this happened, so now there's no hope. I didn't get the job, so forget it. I'm never going to try again. I'm just going to stick with this terrible career that I hate. Well, wait a minute. Just because you didn't get one job doesn't mean God can't open the door somewhere else. Doesn't mean all your options are gone. In fact, one of the greatest things that's helped me from this book was this very concept that when I'm in a good place, I should see life as full of options. And let me ask you this. Do you think our God has many options for any problem? Do you think our God has a million possibilities for almost any challenge or dilemma we face? Do you think God's options are limited? I don't think so. So this, as a Christian, is more true than for anyone else. Because with God, there are always options. There are always possibilities. God can do a million different things that we could never have imagined, that we couldn't even, in our best days, come up with creative solutions like God could come up with. So again, when Jesus says the new wine must be put in new wineskins, I think he's challenging us to see that there is a whole plethora of options, that there is a whole new way of thinking and envisioning our lives, that with God, we are never stuck, we are never trapped, we are never imprisoned. Think about how many great men and women of God have made a difference from prison. Literally, they're trapped. Literally, they're behind bars. Literally, they cannot get out and talk to people and do much. But even Martin Luther King, who we just celebrated his holiday here this week, his letters from a Birmingham jail are some of the most powerful literature ever written. Beautiful, powerful concepts of nonviolent protests. He outlines his whole system of nonviolence based on the teachings of Jesus. Paul wrote many of the letters that are in our New Testament from jail. In fact, he was writing to the church in Philippians. His 4 chapters of Philippians, or 6 chapters of Philippians, come from the jail and being imprisoned. And it was in that book that he said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So even in jail, he did not see himself as limited. So it's the devil that loves to discourage us. It's the devil that loves to tell us it's hopeless. There's nothing you can do about it. You're stuck this way. This is always going to be this way. You'll never have a new career. You'll never fix your family. Your kids will always this, you, whatever. God comes to us and says, listen, if you're going to follow me, if you're going to believe in me, then you have to believe there can be new things, that I can do something out of nothing, that I can create something new out of something old, that I can do beyond immeasurably more than you could even ask or imagine. And that's what I think these new wineskins is all about. It's having that faith. It's a new way of going through life. Now I'm not seeing the limits, I'm seeing the possibilities. Now I'm not seeing what I can't do, I'm seeing what I can do. And this can be life-changing. And it's my prayer for you in 2024 that this will be the year that you let God make you new, that you become the new creation that the Apostle Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 5, when he says, we are a new creation. God wants to do a new thing in your life. And it starts with that faith, and that faith believing that he can do it, that he will do it, that there are many more possibilities and options than you ever imagined. So if you feel like you've been running on a treadmill and getting nowhere, today's your day. Let's get off the treadmill and actually get out. Enjoy the snow. Let's walk in the winter wonderland. If you feel like you've been trapped asking the wrong questions, if you feel like you've been trapped in either or thinking, step that aside. Let God give you new thoughts, new ideas. Believe that something new is here. It's for you. It's for each one of us. Nobody is banned, or nobody is hindered from receiving the grace and the love of God, this new wine, this Holy Spirit that he wants to pour into your life and mine to make a difference. And then we can start asking the right question, which is, God, what would you have me to do? God, what do you want to do in my life? Those are very valuable questions. And I don't know how he'll answer it for you. For each one of us, it will be different. He works with us personally, individually, but I'm excited for you. I'm excited for what he's going to do and what you're going to see happen in your life because of it. So that's my prayer for you for 2024. You have the power. You have the new wine. You have everything that you need in God. Let's let him show us what that means. Thank you.